Good evening, everyone. We are going to kick off our evening meeting for our tree ordinance rewrite project. This is the last of the public engagement meetings for this project. We'll be presenting the draft to the Planning Commission and City Council in May and June. And so the public will continue to have opportunities to give their input at those meetings as well. Just for an outline of what we'll kind of cover quickly this evening, we'll go back over the purpose of the project, some of the community survey results. We'll give a broad overview of the draft rewrite, and then we'll talk about next steps for the project again. The purpose of the project again was to strike a balance with the tree canopy management goals of the city and allowing for new development. Some of the community survey results that we heard were related to thoughts around what makes Brookhaven unique, what areas the city should focus on with its tree canopy preservation efforts, and the different types of programming that the city could add to the items that we already participate in. So the draft rewrite was released on the project website last week, and at the meeting, public engagement meeting that we held today at lunchtime, we started to get some input on the draft that is now available on the project website. Some of the major highlights of the rewrite is that it makes it more user-friendly. We've provided updated definitions. We've revised regulations related to the minimum tree density and tree protection during construction. And the alternative compliance allowances that were in the original ordinance have been removed. As far as next steps, again, today is the final round of public engagement meetings. We will present this item to the Planning Commission and City Council in May and in June with the hope of the council adopting it on June 22nd. Between now and then, again, the public will have the opportunity to continue to comment on the document. And we'll look forward to getting any comments this evening from those of you that are in attendance. With that, I'll open it up to the team. Jeff or India, if you have any initial comments before we open it up to the public for their comments and questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us for the second meeting on this today. The way we did it earlier at noon, I think to kind of go through point for point would take a while. We are more than willing to do that if that's kind of the way this shakes out. The way we approached it earlier today, we just referenced the new draft as questions came up. And we just kind of went to code sections that could best answer those questions and kind of just do our discussion that way. So we'll go ahead and open it up unless India has anything to add.
No, I don't have anything. No, I don't have anything to add.
Seeing that, I don't have any comments on Facebook or in the Q&A or the chat yet, so we'll wait a second and see if we get anything.
That's fine. Yeah, until we get some comments or not, I could hit on some of the key changes. So if you're participating in this meeting, it would probably be best if you could have the draft that's posted on the website pulled up, just to reference as we go along here. And since I'm down to one screen, I'm just going off a printed out version that I'm referencing here. So the code, the new ordinance was essentially rewritten completely. Some of the content from the current code carries over pretty much verbatim. So where that content exists, it might just be in a new code section, because one of the goals with the rewrite was to just simplify the formatting of the code. So to start off with, just with the introduction to the ordinance, kind of the same thing. It's, most tree preservation and management ordinances, you want to explain to people who might not be familiar with the science of trees, the many, many benefits that a healthy canopy brings to our urban environment. So much like the old code, those are listed out. And of course, the economic and aesthetic benefits as well. So then we move into the general applicability. A lot of the same guidelines that exist in the current code are in the new draft here. Some specifics may change in terms of referencing industry standard documents, which for arboriculture tend to always be generated and managed by either ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, and or the ANSI standards, which they're different ANSI standards that apply to trees and horticulture. The definitions, actually, again, there's a lot of carryover, but there's a lot of same terms, new definitions, and then there are a lot of just new terms with new definitions in that section. So some key changes maybe, or additions in the definitions are starting at the top, approved trees. There's a technical definition associated with what the city of Brookhaven considers an approved tree. And that goes for, that mostly applies to land development projects in terms of trees that are being counted towards density and or trees that will be approved to be planted as replacement trees on a site. 2 terms down, this is an important one. So the arborist standards document is basically an industry standards document that is an extension of, will be an extension of the new ordinance. And it's a live document. It's, we framed it such that content within that document can be changed according to emerging best management practices in the field. So in terms of establishing substantial, rules and guidelines for land development, that's really not what the ASD is about. It's more about just technical standards that apply to certain code sections in this draft. For instance, approved tree list. So there's a tree list, quite comprehensive tree list for any tree on a site that is known to grow, whether it's a native species, a naturalized species, or an exotic introduced species known to grow in the Southeast, particularly the Piedmont region, that could be on a site, that could qualify as an approved tree, that could count towards density. And then the other lists that are subject to be added to, modified according to just various findings and observations in the profession are the approved overstory planted tree list or replacement tree list, and the approved overstory tree, so planted in frontages and parking lot, versus the approved overstory list for planted basically in non-frontage or parking lot areas within a site. Standards in terms of tree installation, tree protection, details that accompany those standards and specifications. Again, just emerging standards, technical, field application, whatever it is, that are subject to change in terms of new research, new discoveries, new field trials that don't, at the end of the day, entail a major change within the code itself, if that makes sense. It's not a new idea. Other jurisdictions utilize the same tactic. Are there any questions? If there's not, I can keep going. I'll try to like a little quicker and just hit on key changes.
We did have 2 questions in the Q&A. So the first one was, are street trees in the current ordinance the same as frontage trees in the draft?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that was going to be the next definition I hit on, which there's a technical definition now for frontage area. So the old code kind of uses this general term or the current code, front yard area, and there's a little bit of a definition associated with that. However, the new frontage area definition is the first 15 feet of pervious area of all sites zoned residential, commercial, or owned by the city, which abuts a publicly owned right-of-way. So that would apply to basically any street frontage along a city right-of-way. That first 15 feet of space from whatever the right-of-way property line is. So that's where you have the extension of the arborist standards document that's based on just tons of industry input on which trees currently are performing best in those environments, which are typically the harshest environment you can put a tree is out in a island of a surface parking lot in the southeastern United States in July and August. So that's a pretty short list, and then you have one for less extreme kind of sub habitats within a site. But all of these trees, it's still a fairly short list because at the end of the day, one of the number one goals is overstory canopy and all the benefits that come along with that. I hope I answered that question. If I didn't, let me know.
The next question was, is the current ordinance, the buildable area is the area inside the setbacks on a property? How is that dealt with in this draft?
It's so that hasn't changed. Nothing with the tree ordinance has changed what the code permits in terms of buildable area within a lot. So some ways that that has been addressed is, and I can reference everybody to it, and you'll have to kind of bear with me. I'm getting used to the new code sections also. Here we go. So on page 11 of the new draft, section 1456, and it's in there in a way with the current code section. It's just going to be something that's more streamlined, and it's a more viable option. And it will be something that's basically, I don't know if promote is the right word, just we'll do a better job of making people aware that it is an option for land development. So there's an administrative variance for the purposes of tree preservation. And so the administrative variance is basically, there's no public hearing involved. It's not that type of variance process. Basically, I would present a report for a setback variance where, let's say, just shifting the buildable limits of a house one way or another on a lot 3 feet would protect the root plate of a tree, which would make preservation of said tree a viable option. Basically present that case to the director, to Patrice, and we make that decision that way.
And then next question is, can you please tell us all of the differences between the first posted draft and the draft that was just posted? And for those of you that weren't on the meeting earlier, there was a section that I had not updated based on what the tree canopy division had provided to me, and it's section 1454C that has been updated. So that is available on the project website as of not too long ago. So there weren't any other substantial changes made to the document that's been available for review. Let's see. From the chat, we have a question. What kind of frontage trees and streetscape trees are required under or near overhead power lines?
Yeah, so that, that's something you always have to factor into your tree schedule for a site. It's a really good question. So that's written into the language where, there's a permissible deviation from the overstory list exclusively, where you do have conflicts with overhead utility. So there will be a list on the ASD that kind of spells out those options. So a few selections that I know that Indy and I advocate for in those situations are the Parodia persica. It's a newer, they call it the Persian ironwood. It's not even closely related to the American hornbeam, the ironwood that's native here. It's a great, super tough, super pretty street tree that tops out, completely at maturity. I would say 25, very comparable to a crepe myrtle, one of the medium-sized crepe myrtle varieties. Trident maple is bulletproof, is tried and true. American hornbeam is a tough one in certain situations, which is a native. Hops hornbeam is a tough one. Redbud, dogwoods as frontage trees are not a species that we'll put on the list for frontage. They already have enough problems and they really don't fare well in those harsher settings. So those lists will be out there. They'll be, like I said, that it'll be fully accessible. On the webpage, it'll be an extension of the ordinance. I couldn't tell you every single species right now that will be on that list, but they will be solid, solid selection. Will not be all native. I think we kind of covered that on the last input meetings. You're handcuffing yourself from some really great non-invasive trees that can take the brutal conditions of urban frontage settings if you're trying to go all native. There are also some great native options on the table too.
How far in advance do homeowners need to apply for a permit to cut one or more trees?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, sorry. How far in advance do homeowners need to apply for a permit to cut one or more trees?
One of the things that we need to, that they have to do is that the submittal process is easy and it's online. The only thing that we have to make sure that happens is that they give themselves enough time to schedule for their tree company. As long as the as long as they get their permit request into the portal, it shouldn't take longer than the 10-day cycle that it takes for us to do the reviews.
And those reviews are subject to approval or denial. Currently, India handles all the tree removal permit applications. And so, yeah, we're on a 10-day review cycle, but it's no guarantee that your permit request as is will be approved at those 10 days. Issuance after that is pretty quick. Our permitting department is quite efficient with what they do. So if it's approved, obviously for tree removal permits, the Arborist Division, we're the only reviewers on those permits. If we approve it, it's issued pretty quickly, somewhere within that 10-day cycle.
Okay, so I don't have any other questions in the Q&A or chat or on Facebook. So was there anything else that you thought should be highlighted for those that are on the call?
Yeah, I think I was bogging myself down just trying to go through page by page. So the key changes, the biggest changes, I'll try to remember them all. So the density, tree density, for those on the meeting who might not completely understand what that's all about. There are different industry metrics for tree density. Some jurisdictions, some ordinances do it by way of canopy coverage, existing and or projected for younger trees that are planted. In the Atlanta metro area, and I think it's the more predominant metric, is to do it by way of just cumulative diameter inches, DBH. You might hear that phrase. That just stands for diameter at breast height, which technically translates into the diameter measurement of a tree 4.5 feet above the soil line. So you basically just add up all the inches of all the trees to be preserved on a site that in our case are approved trees. And by the way, another extension of that definition is that no plant species listed on the Georgia exotic pest plant council invasive plant lists qualify, which we already are covering that with our reviews right now. We already do not award density credit for any documented invasive plant species. In fact, we require the removal of all at least woody plant species off of property if they show on a survey. So you tally up all the DBH inches of approved trees on a lot that are to be preserved, and it's typically done by a rate. So it's inches per acre. So the current ordinance is 120 inches per acre for a new development, a new building permit. And with the new draft, we're bumping it up to 130 DBH inches per acre. A key change kind of associated with that is with the current ordinance, which, a little backstory again for people who might not be aware, the Brookhaven tree preservation ordinance was basically just adopted completely from DeKalb County in 2013 when Brookhaven incorporated. And it's been modified a couple times, along the way, but it was still largely, the DeKalb ordinance. So there, within that ordinance, there was this odd, inexplicable drop of required tree density minimum for single-family residential lots whose issuance of CO, certificate of occupation, was older than 5 years. And just all of a sudden you drop from 120 required inches per acre down to 60. So that was, I would say, probably the easiest and most substantial fix of the whole rewrite, was to do away with this just arbitrary drop that allowed people to just take their density down to half of what the minimum required density was for that first 5 years after a new build. So that's a big one. Another substantial change I would say is just redefining, reworking some of the specimen tree criteria. So the only so again, for people who might not be aware of the way the specimen tree part of the code works is that there are certain trees on a site that might qualify as specimen trees, which is a technical term that I can explain in a minute. And those trees have to basically meet 3 conditions to qualify as a specimen tree: species, size, and condition of the tree itself, like the health condition of the tree. So where some changes we made in terms of the condition criterion was that the tree has to come in rated as fair or good to qualify. If it's rated as a tree in poor health, it does not qualify as a specimen tree, even if it's a 45-inch red oak. If it's in poor health, per a report from a certified arborist or a registered forester, we disqualify that tree for specimen consideration. Fair is case by case. If it's reported as fair, we look at the finer details of the assessment on that tree, and we make our decision based off that. So, and again, this is not a new idea that's original for Brookhaven's tree ordinance. Any tree ordinance you look at across the country has some version of this. We toyed around with the idea of just changing literally just the nomenclature of the phrase over to high value tree. At the end of the day, I decided that although I personally wanted to do it, and I think a lot of Brookhaven citizens agreed that maybe that better captured the intent of trying to preserve quality trees on a site. Specimen tree, it's just the go-to industry term for it, and it just felt like it made more sense to stick with terminology that people are used to, that tree companies, consulting arborists, builders are just used to, versus just switching over to a new phrase that is more or less just something different, something else that has to be kind of, people have to get reacquainted with, who are dealing with ordinances and code sections all the time with what they do. So back to it. So if you look at page 7, that's where the specimen tree table starts. And there's some changes there. I try to be more specific with species and genera as they relate to basically what size would put them in specimen category, and to break that down into finer detail. One flaw that, in my opinion, you see on a lot of specimen tree tables is that it doesn't go further than genera, the genus of a group of trees, which is kind of based on this assumption or implication that they have the same function, or they basically have the same role in an ecosystem, and that's not always the case. Or there's an assumption that trees in the same have kind of the same habit, the same mature size, all that stuff, and that's also not the case. So where I felt like it was important to distinguish that Virginia pine shouldn't be in the same category as a loblolly pine or a shortleaf pine due to its size, I bumped it down into a different category. So and also there was just an overall reduction in the DBH size of trees, of, you know, certain species, certain genera that that would capture more trees and recognize more trees on any given lot as potentially being specimen trees.
Jeff, we did have, oh, sorry. I was gonna say, we did get a couple of questions in the Q&A. Is it possible to hold builders and developers responsible for workers and delivery trucks when they run over curbs and shoulders in the right of way to repair or restore these areas? It seems there are careless drivers.
So I think that's a good question. That's something completely did not consider with the first draft. I think, you know, working that into the general applicability section at the beginning, section 1448, I think that could easily be added as, maybe point J in that list, which would address just negligent driving that resulted in injury to right-of-way trees. I think just one little addition in there would help where that was observed. It would help us or code enforcement make a response and have a code section to reference.
The next question is, I understand this draft's recompense is $200 per DBH inch, but Atlanta's is $240. Why aren't we matching Atlanta on that?
Yeah, that's a great question that was asked at the earlier public engagement meeting too. So, as I've already mentioned, one of our goals, and I think we did a good job, was to just better align some things with other jurisdictions, whether it was just something small like a terminology thing or a content item such as this. Because at the end of the day, the easier your code is to interpret, understand, and adhere to, the better it's going to be. In a lot of ways, the more effective it's going to be. So I did borrow, fair amount of content in some way, shape, or form from City of Atlanta, from City of Alpharetta, and a handful of other jurisdictions that we felt like had better tree preservation ordinances than the current Brookhaven ordinance. The 240 for City of Atlanta versus 200, I think the way this draft address better management of specimen size, species, quality trees was to remove the cap. So with the current ordinance, recompense for the removal of specimen trees is capped at 60 inches per acre, which, there are a lot of infill single family residential type construction where even if there are one, basically where there's a lot where there's one specimen tree removed. And typically in that scenario, you don't hit the max. But once you really get to 2+, you hit the max and you're capped, and then there's literally no penalization of throwing on another 3, 4, whatever it is, specimen tree removal. So we felt like at the end of the day, we're not here to collect money. That's not what our goal is. That's not what our directive is with the City of Brookhaven. So our goal was to try to find a way, instead of just making the fees, it's a deterrent. The bottom line is it is a deterrent to remove specimen trees. So we took the cap off. The rate is the same per inch removed. It's the same as the current one, $200, but we took the cap off. So instead of somebody hitting a cap at 60 inches per acre now, which really for certain sites where you see a lot go down, it's terribly insufficient. we just took the cap off. So I feel like whether you're just upping the dollar rate per inch or taking the cap off, those are both better addressing the same problem with, or better making a stronger solution, which is to be a deterrent to just indiscriminate excessive removal of specimen trees off of lots, whether it's a quarter-acre infill lot or, you know, 5-acre commercial development.
Will boundary trees have better protection under the rewrite, and why is there no escrow in the rewrite?
It's a good question. I'll be honest, my perspective, and I think India would agree, number of things about boundary trees. It can tend to be the most litigious part of an arborist review for a new building permit, but also just the, you know, the biological and physiological factors that are at play with many boundary trees and edge trees in Brookhaven, Georgia, and anywhere where you have, you know, just an intense amount of infill development going on. Is this lot sizes aren't changing, but the sizes of the houses being built within these lots are ballooning outward in all directions, right? The footprint of these homes are expanded to the back, to the front, to the sides. So, and it's not just an isolated lot here and there. If you live in Brookhaven, you know that. Half of them have already been torn down and rebuilt, and the other half are soon to come. So where you have a, you know, substantially sized tree within that edge space, within those side setbacks, it takes an impact on its root zone on one side. Guaranteed. If you're India, what would you say? I mean, if you're talking about a 20-inch tree plus, that tree is taking impact on one side of its root zone, and then within no time at all, it's going to be taking impact on the other side. So it, you know, you can cover your bases with what's required in terms of boundary tree agreements and all that, and we have, and I'll explain that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that if the house on this lot is being built to the maximum amount that's allowable by way of the setbacks, which typically they are, and you know, a lot of times the tree's just rebounding from construction impact on this side of its root zone, and then it starts on this side too. That's really tough on a tree. So the way we've addressed it is kind of, we already have, we're requiring more arborist prescriptions for edge trees that can surely pull trees through the impact of construction. And for those who might not know, arborist prescriptions typically are multi-step treatments, care treatments for a tree. It's not just a one-shot deal before construction and then you walk away. There's typically a treatment before construction begins, root fertilization. A lot of times a growth regulator is also included in that formulation that's actually injected into the root zone. That it's basically a hormone treatment for the tree that promotes all new growth in the root system, none above ground, which can really pull a tree through some heavy impact. Preventative insecticidal sprays on the trunk for wood-boring insects, because the moment a tree starts to put out stress pheromones into the air, it's almost like a beacon that draws in wood-boring pest insects that can, you know, just start that ripple effect of decline of the tree. Structural pruning of the crown where needed, and root pruning, which is something that India has been great about bringing to the table and requiring, because there is an allowable amount of impact, including any type of impact, anywhere from just the storage of a pile of gravel all the way to excavating a new basement. And where you have that type of impact where there's no way around it, you're going to be cutting through roots instead of just leaving jagged cuts where the bucket of an excavator is ripped through that part of the root system. You actually make clean cuts, and that's called root pruning. And that's another great practice to make sure that the impact to the tree is at least as minimal as possible in the face of construction. So the way the code addresses that is by way of making sure that the owner of the tree, the legal definition of that is where the center point of the trunk exists. It's very rare to have the center point truly be right there on the property line where the tree is truly legally co-owned by two different property owners. It does happen, but typically it's one or the other. So the boundary tree agreement, there is language in the new draft where it can't be written in such a way that it is an entitlement to destroy or remove the tree. It is simply a notification of impact. It's an acceptance of responsibility for the health of the tree, and it's an acknowledgement of any prescriptive measures for the protection of the tree that are being required by the city, by the arborist division as part of that development project.
Okay, the next question was, can the new draft require inch for inch replacement of trees removed from right of way by the city onto city property or parks? The city should be accountable for maintaining canopy as well.
I think that's a great question. I agree. I know one of the visions and one of the goals, in the entirety of Brookhaven's code is to make it a more walkable, pedestrian-friendly city, which is where, of course, the sidewalk plan comes into play. You've got, your standard 5-foot sidewalk as well as the system of 10-foot multi-use pathways. And I agree 100%. There's a lot of corridor space in there, and I think it's critically important to ensure that you have canopy and shade over sidewalks and streets for all those benefits that are listed off, in the first section of the ordinance. But if you've been in Georgia for any amount of time, you know that when you're walking down the street in July and August, I'm guessing that everybody on this call would rather be walking under the shade of a tree than out in the wide open.
And we got another question in the chat. Can you comment on what new elements of the ordinance will grow our canopy? We have a lot of ground to make up after the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's being approached from so many different angles. One of the biggest and most glaring deficiencies in terms of what I would say the management of the current code with arborist division has been maybe it's one of them. It's the front yard tree requirement. It's there in the current ordinance. The current ordinance requires, I think the language is one front yard area tree for a front yard area that's 2,500 feet or smaller, and then 2 for anything larger than 2,500 square feet. And I mean, it doesn't take long to see that part of the code was mismanaged or just not enforced. You see a lot of front yards of what are clearly newer builds in Brookhaven that have 0 overstory trees. sometimes you'll see an obligatory Japanese maple or a crepe myrtle that's already been headed off, 2 or 3 times in its short life since it's been planted. And to me, not only have I seen, past reviewed site plans where right-of-way trees were allowed to be removed, which we've taken a stance on that. Those are the city's trees, and private development does not have a free pass to remove right-of-way trees. There are certain situations, case by case, where utility, rarely sidewalk, sometimes condition have to be factored in, and we make our decision that way. But the city has reclaimed its right-of-way trees. So where we do reviews and there is a need for a front yard tree, or what we're now going to be calling a frontage area tree, it will be a real tree. It will not be a Japanese maple or a crepe myrtle. It will be a real overstory tree, unless you have one of those overhead utility complexes, at which point we'll make our decision based off that. But it will still be a tree that will perform well and create a good aesthetic along our streets and our sidewalks, and still over time provide shade.
Can you confirm if the current ordinance and this rewrite will require the city to uphold the same standards in public spaces and city parks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hope. I think it will. I think it's covered, and I know our directive from the mayor and all 4 council members are to do a better job with our own projects, and I appreciate that, because in my short time in Brookhaven, I have seen multiple examples where there's been, quite frankly, a lack of compliance, at least with the part of the code section that Indy and I manage. So I hope going forward we can do a better job, and I will make it a point to do my part.
And that was all of the questions that were on Zoom or on Facebook. So did you have any other highlights, Jeff, that you wanted to hit on?
I'm sure there's more. Well, yeah, so one of the biggest ones real quick, and there's a lot. There's no way I'm going to cover them all. So one of the goals here was 2 other goals that I had identified with the rewrite. Was one, there's a terrible paucity of incentives for better tree above and beyond tree preservation in the current code. The only incentive for above and beyond, or what may be a better technical word is surplus tree density for development, only came into play when a specimen tree was removed. Okay, so let's say a density of 14 inch, you have a density surplus of 14 inches on a lot, but 70 inches of specimen tree inches, or specimen tree is owed for recompense. You can take that 14 inches of surplus and apply it to the 70 you owe. So it's better than nothing, but it's still like the only incentive there is also only triggered when a specimen tree is removed. So it's slightly counterproductive. So what we came up with was kind of a more holistic approach for certain sites where there was an opportunity for just better full ecological restoration. So kind of stepping outside of just the narrow scope of trees, particularly in a lot of cases, overstory trees. Kind of like broadening the focus to ecology and even soil health. And are there opportunities to really like bring an ecosystem that's still there, still kind of hanging on in various ways, back to fully restored? or, at least closer to fully restored. So, there are so many sites, any stand of woods you walk into in the Atlanta metro area, pretty much guaranteed to have some level of degradation, some level of maybe erosion or pollution, whatever it is. But the number one is invasive plant species. That's the number one form of readily apparent, readily observable degradation you'll see in tree stands and just remnant patches of forest we have around the Atlanta metro area. So there are two options kind of built into the new draft that give developers, builders, even homeowners an opportunity to kind of opt for the restoration option, where, and all this has to be developed and supervised and driven by a qualified professional, which is another official term in the new ordinance. Qualified professional is a certified arborist with ISA or a registered forester. There are other credentials out there that would qualify somebody as a professional to do this type of work. Obviously, those aren't the only two. But if they were able to document, okay, there's a high level of English ivy within this stand, Elaeagnus privet. However, the canopy is pretty solid. You've got some good oaks in there. You've got some hickories. You've got, a big old tulip poplar. But then the mid-story is pretty solid. You got some red buds and dogwoods. And look at all this cool stuff in the understory. You have all kinds of, buckeye and sweet shrub and things of that nature. So you put together a restoration plan, a plan to eliminate and control all the invasive vegetation, and also replant as needed once the kind of the control measures are taken, and it can be verified that a reasonable level of control has been executed. So the incentive there is there are a lot of sites that have buffer areas, whether it's the 25-foot state waters riparian buffer, or the 25 to 75 for pervious buffers that are associated typically always with streams and waterways for the city. Builders and developers can claim tree inches in that buffer space, which currently is not allowed with the code, so long as a restoration plan is presented as part of the permit documentation and is executed accordingly throughout that development project. Something similar, is basically the exact same idea, is for sites where it's the same thing. You've got a real nice stand of trees. Same thing, execute an invasive control plan with restoration plantings, and you can claim half-inch red buckeyes, half-inch sassafras. You can claim plant material in there that's native and desirable, that's a much smaller size versus the 2 or 4 inch cutoff size for your kind of conventional survey requirements for minimum density. I don't know that I explained that super well, but I think it's actually a really cool option for a lot of sites that Indy and I see all the time on our reviews in Brookhaven.
Trees are woven throughout many of the city guidelines. Once the tree ordinance is final, will there be an opportunity to look at some of the other city ordinances to see if they support the new tree ordinance principles?
I think so. It's been, I'll say, addressing some of that overlap just in-house has been, it's gone well so far. I know, the first thing that comes to mind is the P&Z sidewalk requirement and right-of-way tree conflict. And I think we've already made a ton of headway with navigating both of those requirements, both of those goals within the code. which is to have a more pedestrian-friendly, walkable city, but also to make sure that those spaces are shaded and have a great canopy. And, you know, Brookhaven still has a lot of, you know, large, healthy right-of-way trees, big part of our canopy. So just finding ways to navigate, you know, the addition of sidewalks as infill development plays out in the city, while preserving the canopy wherever possible, and making sure that the canopy within that space is replaced also whenever that's needed.
And then we had one come in the Q&A. Will builders still be able to grade all or most of a lot? How does keeping tree canopy in this instance work? And then what recompense is required?
So, you know, that question, it's kind of like case by case, but I'll say in general terms, no. From what I've seen, it's already, it's really rare. You're not going to see a lot literally graded from head to toe, side to side. However, I know what's being referred to. There are lots still where it's quite excessive. It might as well be, you know, it's close to the full percentage of that lot. So I don't think that's just something that the tree part of the ordinance can address by itself. However, you know, we require preservation on our reviews, and I think that's a key piece of information to be aware of, is that if there are some quality trees on a lot that are outside the buildable limits, and there's no major conflict with anything else that has to occur on that site for development, i.e. grading, installation, utilities, whatever it is, we consider that an indiscriminate tree removal. And you know, our directive is to reduce and eliminate indiscriminate tree removals. It says that at the beginning of the new draft. So kind of associated with that is we've redefined what the critical root zone is for a tree. So when you drive around town and you see construction going on, what you should hopefully see is 4-foot orange fencing staked around the tree. And typically, if the tree is being protected completely, then typically that fencing will be more or less in line with the tree's drip line. You know, the edge of its, the tips of its lateral branches, it should go out that far from the trunk of the tree. 4-inch orange fencing staked into the ground with hay bales staked in, you know, snug behind that orange fencing. That's currently what we require for tree protection. So the calculation for that right now at the current code is 1 radial foot per 1 inch DBH. So if you have a 20-inch tree, the critical root zone on a site plan shows as basically a 20-foot circle centered around the trunk of that tree. The tree science actually says that what is typical of most tree species is that the entire root network is larger laterally, goes out, extends further laterally than the crown. So the new ordinance defines critical root zone, and again, this is borrowed. You see this in a lot of tree codes is 1.3, where the critical root zone actually goes further than the drip line of your typical tree, really regardless of species. So now, if you know where the current code, a 10-foot tree is a circle with a 10-foot radius centered on the tree, it will change over to 13 feet will be the new critical root zone for that tree that has to show on a site plan. So you're adding 3 feet, 3 radial feet to that measurement. And when you're talking about a quarter acre where every square foot counts for reducing impact to the root zone of a tree, for preserving the soil on a site, that can add up. So that's another way that just kind of by default, I would say that's being addressed.
Let's see, there are properties that do not have the minimum required trees or front yard trees. Is there a requirement to have them bring their tree canopy up to 130 inches per acre?
So yeah, that's a great question. Here's how we currently have agreed that in terms of the fair way to kind of retroactively, let's just go with the front yard tree. Let's not even get into density yet. There are a lot of lots in Brookhaven, Georgia that are non-compliant with the front yard tree requirement. If the intent, if the interpretation is it needs to be a tree that at some point it will reach the size where it is a shade tree. It is a tree that casts shade over over the sidewalk and over the street to some degree, right? That's the intent. That's the spirit of the law there. And there are so many lots where if that's your interpretation, if that's what's being required, they're non-compliant. So, but here's the flip side of that. There was at some point that showed on the site plan, and that site plan was approved by an arborist representing the city of Brookhaven. We have agreed that it just doesn't seem completely fair to just retroactively enforce something like that was approved by a past city arborist. However, there are certain blocks where you add up all those non-compliant front yards and it's a pretty barren streetscape. It's quite uninviting and there's certainly no canopies. So there are kind of 2 ways right now that we're trying to address that and manage that. When any of these properties are in for a permit in the system, really of any type, whether it's just a minor site or the addition of a pool or whatever, that's one thing we look at. We actually, sometimes it's a site visit, sometimes it'll show on, an updated tree survey that came along with that site plan. Oftentimes you can at least start the ball rolling by checking Google Street View. Indy and I both, any given time during any of our work days at Brookhaven, I guarantee you on one of our screens, we'll have, a street view pulled up on one of our screens that's of one of the properties we're reviewing a permit for. Most of the street view images for Brookhaven are fairly up to date, fall of 2019 and into 2020. So it's pretty easy to tell when you're looking at a front yard that's not non-compliant in terms of having an overstory tree within that front yard area. So we will put that down as a requirement on the site plan. Even if it's for a pool in the backyard, even if it's for a 5-foot retaining wall for some new landscaping, if the front yard is non-compliant and that property is in for a permit of any type, we will make that a requirement within the proposed scope of work. I feel like that's a reasonably fair approach to bring front yards, back into compliance with overstory trees being in that front yard area. The other approach that we're going to start advocating for and develop like an initiative for is more just awareness. There are a lot of options out there to go out and get free or highly discounted overstory trees. Trees Atlanta, we partner with them on the front yard tree projects. You can buy 1 or 2 overstory trees for a grand total of $25. They bring it out, they install it, they do establishment watering if you want. And I think for a lot of these properties, just creating that awareness, whether it's, door handle flyers or, a banner on the website or a combination of things, promoting these options for good quality shade trees at virtually no cost, I think is another way to recapture and reestablish the next generation of shade trees back into the streetscape of Brookhaven, especially where you have these non-compliant front yards. We hope that maybe over time we could figure out, kind of hash out all the details and even offer something in-house. The tree rescue program is something that we're still working to make fully operational. There's already been some examples of it, and we're working on another little project right now. But over time, we might have enough stock for Brookhaven just in-house to offer, big, nice 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch, high quality trees that are basically rescued out of the building envelope of an impending development, stored at the future Osborne Park Tree Nursery, and for the cost of just labor, basically what it costs to pay a tree transplant company with specialty equipment. You get a tree, you get a $500, $600 tree in your yard just for the cost of labor, just for the service, which I think is a cool idea that will take shape, no doubt. I mean, the commitment to that idea is from the very top. That's coming from mayor and council, city manager, everybody's on board, and there's a plan to get there.
That looks like all of the questions that we have on Zoom and on Facebook. Were there any other things you or India wanted to highlight?
Well, like I said, there's more there, but I think we've hit on most of the substantial changes that I think will have positive results for better management of Brookhaven's canopy. But if anybody has any follow-ups, Patrice will remind everybody what the address is, and we'll field those questions. We're glad to answer more questions as they come up. Questions, concerns, anything.
Yeah, so the project website has the most recent draft of the ordinance. It also has the schedule for going forward. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please email trees@brookhavenga.gov, and we'll be happy to respond to any questions or review any comments that you may have on the document. So at this time, we just want to thank everyone for attending this evening. If you need assistance or have any questions, just reach out. We're here and available to answer any questions or review any comments that you may have. So,
thanks everybody for joining in and offering your input and helping us along this process.
have a good evening, everyone.